Hello and welcome to Week 7, History of Art 1, Prehistory to Medieval, FINA H111. This is being presented by Indiana University-Purdue, University of Fort Wayne, and our topic for this week is the Republic and Empire of Ancient Rome. We have a lot of ground to cover, so let's jump right into our first slide. So let's begin, as I often like to do, with a map. Everything you're seeing here, most of Europe, over into the Near East and Northern Africa, the entire Mediterranean, was at one time a part of the Roman Empire. Pretty much everything you're seeing on the map was under the dominion of the Roman Empire. So we discussed the foundations of Rome a little bit last week when we spoke about the Etruscans. The city was founded in 753 BCE near the Tiber River. And as you guys already know, Etruscan kings ruled there until about 509 BCE, at which point the Romans overthrew the Etruscan monarchy and established a republic. This republic did not have a constitution, but it was established more or less on agreement, particularly amongst the ruling classes of Europe at the time. So we'll be bouncing around all over Italy and looking at examples of Roman art as they scatter across Europe. We're going to begin in the Republic. We'll see a few things dealing with the Republican art, and then we'll move on into the Imperial era. Here's a simple little timeline for us to keep our dates straight. So the Republic is founded about 509-510 BCE and is around for quite a while into the year 31 BCE. About the year 31, we'll see the collapse of the Republic and the rise of the Roman Empire, which will take us into the Common Era. We can think about the Roman Empire lasting really until about 395 CE, when we'll see the schism and the split of the empires into the Western Empire and then the Eastern Christian Byzantine Empire, at which point they really become two separate entities. But don't want to get ahead of myself. That's where we're going with this. Let's start talking, though, with the Republic. So the Roman Republic was a non-constitutional republic overseen by a type of Senate. The Senate would be elected by the citizens. Citizenry was limited to males who held land and who were literate. So it was a very confined citizenry. That Senate could then elect from its ranks a consul, who was sort of the head of the Senate, not quite what we would consider like a president or prime minister, but not too far off. The consul was able to propose law, could act as a senior judge, presided over the Senate, was the commander-in-chief of the army, and had those sorts of executive responsibilities. There was also the praetor, who was also elected from the Senate. He also could act as a judge and therefore could create law by legal precedent. Also, an officer of the government would be something called the censor. He was also elected by the Senate. The censor oversaw the census. That's where we get his name from. He promoted or demoted individuals in the social class, which made him very, very powerful. Including senators. He could award and oversee public contracts. So the censor was responsible for decreeing your rank in society. And Roman Republic society was extremely hierarchical. You could vote. It was a republic without a constitution. The Senate was voted in office by the citizenry, but the citizenry was relegated to basically freeborn, land-owning male citizens. Women were not allowed to vote. If you were not freeborn, you were not allowed to vote. And if you didn't own land, you were not allowed to vote. Now, these rules will change and will shift a little bit over the centuries, but essentially, at the beginning of the Republic, that's what we're looking at. So if we start looking at this piece, this is the temple of Fortuna Virilis, the temple of Portunus in the city of Rome, created somewhere about 75 BCE. What we're going to notice that a lot of Roman art, whether we're talking about the Republic or the Empire, a lot of this art, it deals with the rhetorics of power and the idea of displaying imperial or governmental strength in some way. Excuse me. At the height of Roman power during the Empire, the city of Rome itself will have approximately 1 million people in it. And certainly while today in the 21st century there are many, many cities with multiple millions of people, do keep in mind a city of over 1 million people in ancient times, that is an extraordinarily dense population. And we'll see that occurs in Rome for certain. As we take a look at this piece, this temple, pretty typical of Republic houses of worship. So we're using the Roman pantheon, the Roman pagan pantheon. This is a temple to Portunus. And I hope you guys are able to see a lot of similarities here, not just to Greek architecture, but also to Etruscan architecture. The Romans were extremely fond of the Greeks, and are getting a lot of cultural influence from Greek culture. And certainly with things like this, you might want to consider early Roman architecture a really nice blending of both the Etruscan and the Greek. So this is an Etruscan layout with the raised podium that the temple is on. You see the enclosed back half. You see the colonnade around the porch, and then the engaged columns around the back. It looks in layout very much like an Etruscan temple, but then the orders of architecture and the pediment is very Greek. And that will be a key feature of a lot of Roman architecture, is this blending of Etruscan and Greek. So an important distinction, though, between the Romans and the Greeks is while most Greek art that we looked at focused on mythology and the gods and goddesses, Roman art tends to, more often than not, focus on reality, on politics, on ancestry, very sort of real-world types of issues. What we're looking at here is a funerary relief with the portraits of 3 men on it. This is dated to about 30 BCE, carved out of marble, approximately 2 feet high. And what we're going to notice with Roman Republic art, particularly anything relegated to funerary traditions, is a great deal of interest in realism and trying to create portraits that really look like portraits. And I want you to keep this in mind as we get towards the end of this lecture and we talk about the end of Rome. What we'll see is an important shift away from this emphasis on realism towards something else. But in the Republic period, we want to talk about verism and veristic portraits. So veristic means that we have a portrait that is true to life, that looks realistic. So as we look at these 3 men, although they've been damaged, you know that there's some damage on the noses, we can still see that there's a great deal of emphasis on the eyes, on the face, the ears, on the wrinkles, on the hair. This is sort of a warts and all kind of portraiture that wants to capture a likeness of these individuals. This is important because ancestor veneration is a very important part of Roman society. You worship the gods and goddesses, of course, but you also probably in your home have some sort of shrine to your ancestors. And that's where something like this might be, or a small portrait bust might be. It was considered extremely important in ancient Rome to always be venerating and thinking about the honor of your ancestors. So let's take a look at another example. So here's another example of a Republic era portrait. Really fantastic piece, carved out of marble again, and just look at the texture and the detail, the wonderful wrinkles and folds in the face. The wonderful detail in the brow and in the ears and even in the lines on the neck. And this is what we're talking about with veristic portraits. Very common in ancestor veneration, extremely common throughout the Republic. Now this fellow is a patrician. So the patricians were a sort of upper class, if you will, distinct from the plebeians, who are the lower class sort of workers of Rome. And this social hierarchy is extremely important. It is the patricians who are the ones who are eligible to become senators, who are the ones who basically control the commerce and the money, and the plebeians are the ones who are doing the hard work. And if you're sort of in a merchant class, you might have a little bit of social mobility. It is feasibly possible for you to move from a plebeian class into patrician class. It's very rare, though. It's extremely difficult to do. It is at least theoretically possible. But at any rate, if you were a patrician, you had some money to spend, and certainly a portrait bust like this would be something you would want to do for your ancestor veneration. So now we need to move into the Roman Empire and the Imperial Period of Rome. So if you're familiar at all with Julius Caesar, if you've read the play, or if you're just sort of familiar with his story in history, you know that he was elected consul, and so he was an elected official at first, and he ruled over the Roman Republic as the consul. At some point, because of some military conflicts that Rome was going through, and I should point out that during the Republic, Rome was very, very active in expanding its borders. They would use military conquest. They would also use economic forces to basically try to bring surrounding cities under their sphere of influence. They were rather aggressive in that way, trying to spread their culture and their form of government and their economics and all of this all across Italy. And we spoke a little bit about this last week when we talked about the Etruscans. But Julius Caesar, an actual guy, he's not just a fictional character, he's elected consul, and he is ruling in the Republic according to those laws. Now, because of the conflicts that are happening and some of the economic strife that Rome is experiencing because of that, Julius Caesar enacts an edict that is a part of the government. Now, this is completely legal. He declares himself to be dictator of Rome. Now, Rome basically has it within its bylaws, if you want to consider it that way, this thing called dictatorship. In times of strife or military conflict, the Senate of Rome realized that there were times when you just needed one man in charge who did not need the approval of the Senate, who did not have to go through due process. Sometimes you just need one person in charge who can just give orders that everyone else can follow so that we can move very quickly. That person's called the dictator. In times of strife, the Senate could go to the consul or the praetor and declare him dictator, which meant he had all executive powers, and you really weren't allowed to question him. Now, the theory behind a dictatorship was that it was a purely temporary position. The idea was that in times of strife, one man becomes dictator, he rules with absolute authority. Once the crisis is over, he will step down, and then we will resume our republic and the more democratic notions of government. So Julius Caesar becomes dictator completely legally. He's able to resolve the particular conflict that he's facing and Rome is facing, but, as you might imagine, at the end of that, he says, you know what, I'm just going to stay dictator for life. And I'm not going to step down, and we're not going to resume the Republic. I'm just going to be ruler for life, and I'm going to start a new dynasty called the Julian Dynasty. Well, the Senate is obviously not too happy about this. And again, if you know anything about the history, you know that the Senate decides to take matters into their own hands. And in the year 44 BCE, the Senate gets involved in an uprising against Julius Caesar and eventually assassinates him in the courtyard of the Senate, in a pretty gruesome way by all accounts. So we have the assassination of our dictator. This completely fractures the government because we have a lot of sources, a lot of people, including a vast majority of the Roman army, who were very loyal to Julius Caesar. Once he's assassinated, they more or less break away from the Republic and from the Senate. So now we have Republicans basically battling imperialists. We have an increasing fracturing of Roman society. They basically collapse into a type of civil war where they're fighting each other out, and there's fighting in the streets of Rome to try to resolve this issue. Eventually what happens is that there's a young man named Octavian. Octavian is the adopted nephew of Julius Caesar. Now, there was an interesting thing that you could do in Rome if you were a member of the upper class. You could adopt a person, make them your son, patrilineal lines of succession. So you could make that person your son, and legally speaking, that person was in all rights and inheritance and decision-making your legal heir. This was extremely common amongst the patrician class. It was kind of an interesting twist on this idea of inheritance, this idea that your biological children may not actually be the best people for the job, and so you could just adopt an adult to fulfill your role as heir. Makes a lot of sense in a way. But Octavian was Julius Caesar's sort of nephew, and he became Julius Caesar's son through adoption. And so when Caesar was assassinated, Octavian rose up, and he tried to take Julius Caesar's place at the head of the army, and he spoke very passionately about it. His main opposition was a guy named Mark Antony. Mark Antony had allied himself with the remnants of the Egyptian army in the Egyptian Empire, who at that time was under the rule of the Queen Cleopatra. So you've probably heard a bit of this story before. This has been romanticized in television and movies quite a bit, but there is actually a fair amount of actual truth to the story. In the sake of time, we'll just sort of gloss over some of the details. It was a very long civil war, a time of tremendous strife and violence in the city. Eventually, Octavian is able to defeat the forces of Mark Antony and Cleopatra. He's able to bring the other patricians into line, into his way of thinking, and Octavian comes to the throne and declares himself the emperor. And at that point, when Octavian he has basically buried the republic at that point. We no longer have a republic form of government. Now we're in an empire with an absolute ruler, with an absolute emperor. He enthrones himself as such and renames himself Augustus. So if you've heard the name Augustus Caesar, that's Octavian. That's his royal name when he ascends the throne. Astoundingly, he's probably no more than about 36, we think, when he finally does this. So he's a very, very young man, and we're seeing his representation here. So this moves us from art of the Republic era into art of the Empire. And a great place to start with that is with this, the portrait of Augustus as a general from Prima Porta. This dates to about 20 BCE, and it's quite a large piece. Augustus here is about 6'8". And what we'll notice in Imperial Rome is a shift away from the verism of the Republic. Ancestor veneration, of course, is still going to be very important, but as we move into a different political system, we'll see some of the same characteristics that we noticed in other ancient civilizations will reawaken here in ancient Rome. So in depictions of the emperor, what we'll notice is a great deal of idealization. Certain characteristics will be played up. We're not as interested when it comes to portraits of the emperor in realism and showing him exactly how he looked, in that idea of the likeness of the portraiture. Instead, we're much more concerned about showing what our ideal representation of leadership should be. So in this representation of Augustus, you notice he looks very youthful. He looks very strong and muscular. He's wearing this breastpiece that has this really wonderful engraved scene on it, a scene from mythology. He's holding a staff. He's in a pose. You may recognize that pose from last week when we talked about alla metele. That's called an orator's pose. And essentially, if you were making a public announcement as a leader or senator or what have you, you would stand in the forum with your hand up in that gesture, and that indicated to everyone around you that you were saying something important and they needed to pay attention to you. So we see Augustus doing that here. Now, Augustus lived to a pretty ripe old age, but something you will not ever see is a picture, a portrait of an old emperor. You'll see them at his youth. Is most youthful and vital is going to be really important. So we've seen these concepts of portraiture in almost every culture we've looked at so far in this class. We saw it in the ancient Near East, we saw it in Egypt. This is a very common idea to try to embody the message of the leader within the body of the leader. You may notice at the lower left-hand side of the image sort of this odd little human shape to the side of Augustus there. That's a Cupid, and Cupid is, of course, related to the mythology of the goddess Venus, and that's an important link that Augustus is making here. When Julius Caesar, who you remember is Augustus's uncle, when Julius Caesar declares himself the emperor and changes the form of government in Rome, he legitimizes his claim by claiming that he, Julius, is the son of the goddess Venus, and so therefore has the right to rule in absolute power. That's how he's legitimizing his claim to this emperorship. When Augustus is eventually able to seize control for himself, one of the reasons that he's going to give for continuing imperial rule instead of going back to a republic is this idea of absolute authority from the gods and goddesses. So the Cupid there is a little signal, a little visual clue to the people who look at this, that he is descended from Venus, that he has the blood of gods, and so that is why he is allowed to rule with absolute authority. Now there's still a Senate, and the Senate is still very much involved in the day-to-day operations of the empire. There are all kinds of committees, all of the things that we today sort of associate with government. But what's important about the imperial office, about being the emperor, he is the absolute authority. We essentially, after Julius Caesar, never get rid of a dictatorship. He is the head, the absolute authority, and the government, in the judicial system, of the military, and also of the religion, the official state religion. He is the head of that as well. In addition to statues glorifying the emperor, we'll also see a great deal of architectural commemorations involved with the empire. This is called the Ara Pacis Augustae, or the Altar of Augustan Peace, and it dates from about 13 to 9 BCE. We're taking a look at the southwest corner here. It was dedicated in the year 9 BCE, and the entire purpose of the structure, it is an altar, but it's not really what we would consider a temple or really that sacred of a religious space. This is a piece of commemorative architecture to glorify Augustus. And we'll see this quite a bit with commemorative arches and pillars and so on. These emperors, once they come to the throne, feel the need to really leave their mark on the city with these extremely grand, audacious projects to let the people, the plebeians, know that they're in control and that they're very powerful. What we'll get in the Roman Empire is an almost what we today would call a cult of personality that revolves around the emperor. The emperor is bigger than life. He's descended from the gods. He has absolute authority. And we'll see that in the rhetorics of the architecture that gets promoted during this time. So we'll just take a look at a couple of pieces from the Ara Pacis. So this is a dedication to, not to Augustus specifically, but to the peace that he brings. So after Julius Caesar dies, Rome collapses into a civil war, essentially. Fighting in the streets of Rome, fighting all across Italy, and it's an increasingly dark and violent time. Once Augustus is able to defeat his enemies, in a violent way, of course, there's finally peace in Rome. Things are finally quiet. And we kind of get a sense, looking at the historical record, that most of the plebeians, the sort of average people of Rome, didn't really care who was in control. They just wanted the fighting to stop. They just wanted the blood to stop. And so they were just happy to have peace. And this was a commemoration of that for Augustus. So let's take a look at a couple of the reliefs that wrap all the way around this piece. So this is a scene from the Ara Pacis. And it's quite a large piece. As you can see, it's about 5'3", carved into marble on the surface of that building. We have an interesting scene here. We haven't had many scenes quite like this before. We believe this is a personification, like an allegorical scene, where we have a personification of a peace, both peace and Mother Earth being represented here. So we see that central figure, who may be sort of a lesser goddess named Tellus, related to earth and peacefulness. We see that she has fruit on her lap and also a couple of children. She's surrounded by animals. We notice a couple of smaller figures on either side of her, also supported by animals, with their cloaks being blown up in the air. And because this is a temple dedicated to the peace that Augustus has brought to Rome, we think that this is an allegorical representation of the bounty of Rome. Now that the fighting is over and we can return back to a more peaceful state and a more productive state. So it's an interesting representation in that regard, that we have a goddess figure who may or may not be a literal representation of a goddess. Not necessarily because we're going to make offerings to this goddess or we want to appease this goddess the way we've seen in many other cultures, but really just as a symbolic, iconographic representation of the idea of peace and the idea of bounty. It's a slightly different way. It's a more subtle way of communicating these ideas. And it makes this entire building extremely interesting. It's a temple, but it's not really a place of active worship. There are offerings being made, but it's, again, much more about this monument to the idea of peace and the idea of collusion that we have now that Augustus is the emperor. Just a few points about the style. We'll notice that these figures are very idealized. They have a certain perfect form to them. They're fairly naturalistic. We get a nice little sense of depth and perspective with the piece, so some extremely sophisticated artistic techniques going into this piece. Now, not everything on the Ara Pacis is allegorical, though, so let's take a look at another image that also comes from the temple. So on the same building, we also see images like this. This is a procession of the Imperial Family. So it's the immediate and extended family of Augustus in a royal procession. So this is not allegorical. This does not symbolize anything in particular. And this will be a holdover from that republic, this idea of showing more or less accurate depictions of real people, especially as they relate to the royal family. We see a great deal of interest in the robes, in the clothing. The faces are just fantastic. You can see that it's a kind of busy scene with all of these figures overlapping each other. Really great representations of the children in the foreground. What I particularly like about this frieze is you can almost get a sense as you look at it of a bunch of impatient people standing in line, which is what this is. These are all members of the imperial family. They're lined up according to their rank and status within the family. And they're just waiting to go up to the temple, waiting to make a little offering, sort of be seen by the crowd. And we get a sense of them talking to each other, interacting with each other. I especially like the small child sort of off-center to the right, who's hanging on to his father's cloak there. Really fantastic realism in that child. You really get a sense those kids especially are just bored and just want to run away and go play, and they kind of look like they're about to do that. Really fantastic use of that sort of realism there. So this has nothing to do with the gods or goddesses, except for, how Augustus might relate to the gods or goddesses. This is much more about document and a lot more about politics. These are the who's who of Rome, the important people, the power family of Rome. And that's a shift that we'll notice throughout most Roman art. References to the gods and goddesses are always going to be there. Those idealized representations of the emperor are always going to be there. But the Romans are extremely political. And they really know how to embody their politics in their visual images. And that will be a big part of how the Romans operate throughout the imperial era. So let's say you're a member of the patrician class, the sort of upper class of Rome, but you're not necessarily a royal. You're not a part of the imperial family. You would probably have a home, much like we see in this image here. A standalone house, home, probably multiple generations of family living within it, but still quite a nice place. We're looking at the central courtyard, or atrium, of the house. This would be the center hall, and where most business and visiting and affairs would be conducted right here. Off to either side, there would be a series of rooms, smaller rooms, off to the sides and sort of behind us here in this view. And that's where, of course, the bedrooms would be, storage areas, servants' quarters. How much of that there is would depend, of course, on how wealthy a family we're talking about. You'll notice that we have a nice sky roof here, a nice open area in the roof, and beneath it is a very shallow depression into the floor. That's called an impluvium, and that's where we would collect some fresh rainwater, a part of our drinking water. It's also just a nice aesthetic effect. So if you were a part of the patrician class, you did most of your business, most of your work probably from home. People needed to come to you to talk about business or talk about money lending or something like that. They would come up to the front of your home. A servant would likely greet them, and then they would be announced to the head of the household, who would greet them here in the atrium. And it would be a whole little ritual that would go out. Now, these rooms off to the side would often have a great deal of painting in them. We would see portraits of ancestors. This is where many of those kinds of artifacts would be found. Now, your book is going to discuss some of the different painting styles in a little bit more detail. So do pay attention to that in your book. We're just going to take a quick look at a piece of portraiture, though. So in addition to many of the styles of paintings that your book discusses, we also find things like this portrait of a husband and wife from a house in Pompeii. The last image I showed you of the home was also found in Pompeii, so you probably recognize that city. It's most famous for being destroyed by a volcano. Bad for the people of Pompeii, great for us, because it preserved all of their houses and art so that we can take a look at it in a lot of detail. As we look at this couple, we can tell they're of a upper, more sophisticated class. They are not plebeians. We can tell that because they had the money to have a portrait made, of course. We can also see what they're holding. You see that the husband there on the right is holding a scroll. That's indicating that he's literate, that he's probably a businessman. And the woman on the left is actually holding like a tablet. That would open up and you could write inside of there. So what very often happened in ancient Rome is if you were a part of this sort of upper middle class or a merchant was your type of business, although the lines of inheritance were patrilineal, so it went from father to son along patriarchal lines, women were very much involved. This is not like ancient Greece. In ancient Greece, women were very shut away and sequestered and were not allowed to participate in public life much at all. In Rome, things were quite different. Women were allowed out in public. They were allowed to participate. They were not equal citizens, for the most part, to their husbands. But they were allowed to read and write and participate, and it was extremely common amongst the patrician classes for wives to be right there by their husband's sides, conducting business. And if a husband needed to go off to another city to make certain treaties or conduct his business elsewhere, the wife typically took over things at home and would write contracts and pay money and just take care of things. So it was a much different sort of attitude towards women in Rome than we saw in ancient Greece. The portrait themselves, really nicely done. Wonderful sophistication of the technique. We see a great deal, again, of interest in the detail of the faces, the likenesses. I really get a sense that I know what these people look like. We see them proudly holding up that tablet and the scroll. They want you to see the type of people they are, their sophistication, their education. That's extremely important to them. So these houses, as I mentioned, would have contained probably multiple generations. So the children of this couple, most likely the eldest son, would have his family in the house, and then his eldest son would have his family in this house. So the whole idea of this, much like what we saw in the Republic, is to venerate these ancestors, to honor and respect them after they've passed on. So now let's move on to some of the large-scale building projects that we associate with the Roman Empire. This, as many of you probably recognize right away, is the Colosseum in Rome. Now, we call it the Colosseum, but it was originally called the Flavian Amphitheater. That's its proper name. The name Colosseum derived from the Latin word Colossus, meaning colossal. This was in reference to a gigantic statue of the Emperor Nero, which was originally on this spot. So we had an emperor named Nero, who, by all accounts, was kind of crazy, and not a very good emperor, and didn't really care about the citizens of Rome. He was extremely extravagant, basically nearly bankrupted the empire by spending all of his money on a massive golden palace, with warm baths and decked out in marble, like a really extraordinary place. It doesn't exist anymore, and I'll indicate to you why. He built this palace, and then outside of it he built what we call a colossus, which is a colossal statue of himself, of Nero, in some sort of triumphant pose, no doubt. Meanwhile, while he's spending all of this money, the citizens of Rome are suffering because there's no money in the city for building projects, for sanitation, for food distribution, none of the things that a dense urban environment, which Rome is at this time, with nearly 1 million people in it, none of the things that they need. He's essentially setting up, because Nero is not competent and not very bright, he's setting himself up to be overthrown. The people of Rome become extremely suspicious and extremely agitated. revolution basically is in the air. People are starting to talk about, well, maybe we should go back to a republic or something. What happens then is a general, a very well-respected and well-liked general named Vespasian, can see the writing on the wall, sees that things are starting to go south. He will initiate an uprising to overthrow Nero. There's a coup. Vespasian is able to overthrow Nero. Nero dies, and the army and the people of Rome basically allow Vespasian to take his place as emperor. He becomes emperor. So Vespasian becomes emperor, and now he's in a very tricky spot. The people of the Rome are not too happy with this whole idea of the emperor. They're really, very disagreeable to the government right now. Vespasian has the loyalty of the army, which is very important to try to keep people in line, but he realizes after he's able to grab the throne for himself that he's got to do something to appease the people. He's got to make them fall back in line for the idea of an emperor. So one of the first major things that he does after he establishes order, he tears down the Golden Palace and he tears down the Colossus of Nero. And on the spot where those things were, he begins construction on this, the Roman Colosseum. So it was an amphitheater dedicated entirely to the people of Rome. It was, and when I say it's an amphitheater, I mean this is a tremendous piece of architecture. It covers an area of approximately 6 acres, and as you may have already heard or read, the main purpose of the Colosseum was to hold gladiator combats and other types of public spectacles, all of which were absolutely free to the people of Rome. If you lived in the city of Rome, you could go there for free. It was a very common form of entertainment. And this was very much a notion of trying to appease the people and make them feel good about imperial government again. So you could go there for free. You could watch this entertainment pretty much all day. You could get food and drink there. Sometimes food and drink was free also. And all of this was just to try to soothe the populace and make them feel better about the government again. As you can see, looking at this shot, it's quite a large piece. It covers about 6 acres. The outer circumference measures about 1,788 feet and is over 187 feet high. And it's about 615 feet long and over 510 feet wide. So it's an enormous, enormous space. I'll show you a different view of it, and I'll talk about some of the other features. Here's an aerial view looking down into the Colosseum as we see it today. As we look down in there, you'll notice that sort of oval area at the very bottom. There was originally a floor there that was covered with sand, so that's gone. So we're actually seeing the inner workings underneath the main arena there. In that arena, there were approximately 36 trapdoors that allowed for very elaborate special effects, and these were spectacular shows. There were wild and exotic animals that would be paraded and sometimes slaughtered throughout the arena, including lions, tigers, hyenas, hippos, rhinos, crocodiles, ostriches, antelopes, bears, zebra, basically any kind of wild animal that looked exotic or odd or ferocious. The Romans would import them into the city so they could come to the Colosseum. Of course, we know about the gladiators. That's a very common thing to talk about in pop culture. There were actually about 20 different ranks of gladiators. The whole Colosseum was a staging area for these very gruesome gladiator fights, wild animal displays, theatrical entertainment, executions, religious ceremonies. They had mock sea battles where they would flood the flora of the Colosseum, and people in miniature scale boats would fight each other, which had to be amazing. Most of the time, those battles would be reenactments of famous Roman victories. The amphitheater was built out of travertine on the outside and tufa and brick on the interior. The main pedestals were built out of marble, so we have a great variety of materials here. In building the Colosseum, most of the labor was done by a very large population of slaves. They undertook the manual labors. In terms of professional Roman builders, engineers, decorators undertook more of the skilled regions. That's how we're able to build this place that's so large in a relatively short period of time. It's 4 stories high. The first 3 levels had high arched entrances, designed with Ionic, Doric, and Corinthian columns. As we're looking down at the piece here, you can just sort of see along the outer rim some openings. That's probably what is left of the retractable awning called the velarium that provided cover and shade over the nosebleed seats at the very top there. Brackets supported 240 wooden masts on which a canvas awning were hung. So this was an enclosed, well, not entirely enclosed, but it did have a roof on it, at least a partial roof on it. There were 76 entrances, which were all numbered. There were an additional 4 grand entrances, which were not numbered, and the grand entrances was where most of the processions and gladiators would come in and out. If you're a Roman citizen, it was free to get into the Colosseum, but you had to have a ticket. Tickets were distributed for the shows, each one marked with a seat number, tier number, and entrance number, and this may sound familiar to anyone who's gone to a big arena show. The inaugural games, when this first opens, lasted for more than 100 days. They had these grand spectacle events lasting every day for over 100 days. At the end of a day of games, the gladiators who had been killed would be dragged through what was called the Gate of Death to the Spoilarium, where their body was stripped and the weapons and armor given to other gladiators. The arena itself was 287 feet long and 180 feet wide, and the whole arena was covered with about 15 centimeters of sand. These games and events were extraordinarily bloody. It's kind of a fascinating thing about the ancient Romans. They were incredibly bloodthirsty, it seems. All of the gladiatorial fights ended in some kind of bloodshed. Many of the animal displays ended in animals fighting each other to the death. Extraordinary bloody. I mentioned executions took place here. If you were a threat to the state and the state wanted you to be executed, they would do it publicly, and usually in incredibly horrific ways, being fed to lions or torn apart in various different ways. All of that was completely free to be seen by the public and was a form of entertainment. It was a quite common way to spend an afternoon going to see some executions. It's a very sort of odd thing here. We estimate approximately 700,000 people died in this arena, in the Colosseum. This is not the only Colosseum. It's not the only amphitheater that was built in the Roman Empire. Most major cities had at least one amphitheater, perhaps not this size or scale, but they had something similar. So we think about 700,000 people died in this one place with these games. Executions included many different types of Christians and, of course, many different types of criminals and also Christians, and was a really popular form of midday entertainment. Eventually Christianity, which we haven't spoken about much, but eventually Christianity will become seen as a threat to the Roman Empire and will be outlawed within the empire. And if you're suspected of being a Christian, a popular way for the government to get rid of you would be to execute you publicly. We do know that as many as 5,000 animals were slaughtered in one day during one set of games. We do know that there were some animal species that were actually killed to the point of extinction, and we know that from various records that the Romans kept. The entire amphitheater took less than 10 years to build, which again is absolutely amazing when you start thinking about the scale of this thing. At its height, This could hold approximately 60,000 spectators. Some estimate perhaps as many as 80,000 spectators. But it was so well designed and so well laid out that even if it were packed full with 60, 70,000 people, it could be completely exited in a non-rushed, non-chaotic manner, in a very orderly fashion, in less than 15 minutes. Which is really quite astounding. Again, if you've ever gone to an arena show nowadays, try to think about how much of a hassle it was to get out of the show afterwards. Here's a view from the inside of the Colosseum, looking at some of the seating areas. The seating areas were sequestered according to your rank and position. If you were a patrician, upper class, you had better seats. The emperor, of course, had his own box seat. And if you were a plebeian, sort of the lower classes, you had, kind of bad seats way up high at the top of the Colosseum. There were vendors. You could buy food and drinks. You could buy souvenirs. Some of the gladiators that fought in the arena became extraordinarily famous, kind of like professional sports stars now. You could seriously buy action figures, little wood or stone carved action figures of your favorite gladiators. It's really kind of startling once you research the history how much this echoes a lot of our culture today. Without all the killing, of course, but just this worship of sports celebrities and the image of sports celebrities. Gladiators very much had that kind of position. So this building tells us a lot about the Roman Empire. It was considered a gift to Roman citizens to increase the popularity of the Flavian dynasty. By staging various forms of entertainment in a purpose-built stone amphitheater, it created a diversion for unemployed and unruly plebeians. So this is a big part of why the Colosseum was built and why it was important. We have all of this unrest. The Flavian Empire dynasty from Vespasian is very concerned about bringing people under control by giving this as a gift to them, by allowing them to attend the games for free, by staging all of this at the expense of the government. He wants to distract people from their problems. In a city of over 1 million people, unemployment is extremely high, and when you get large concentrations of unemployed and dissatisfied people, that's where revolutions happen. That's where governments get overthrown. So if you've ever heard the term bread and circuses, this is where it comes from. Vespasian realized that in order to placate the Roman people, he needed to distract them with entertainment, with giving them sort of tokens of, here, come to the Colosseum, sit here all day, drink some wine, eat some bread, enjoy the games, and if you're distracted like that, you're not going to agitate, you're not going to try to change things, you're going to allow me and the Senate to just rule. There's also some other reasons and some other purposes for the Colosseum. It did allow Romans to utilize and showcase the latest in engineering techniques to demonstrate to the world the power of Rome, and this was very much a tourist mecca. It is now, and it was then. Once this goes up and opens up, people all over the world hear about the Colosseum in Rome and want to attend it. And it's a way to bring the rest of the world and make them aware of the city and glory of Rome. So this is a portrait of Vespasian. So he's the guy responsible for the Colosseum. And what we'll notice about him in this portrait, quite different from what we saw with the portrait of Augustus. Here Vespasian, he's shown to be a little bit older. He has sort of a kind, soft expression. He's not being presented as a general or authoritarian. And this is very much a part of what he wants to communicate. We're using the artwork here to display a political message. Coming off of Nero and the corruption of the state under the rule of Nero, Vespasian feels that it's very important that he project this image of himself as being somebody who's kind, who cares for the people, who wants to better the lives of the people. Whether or not that's true, he wants to project that image. And ancient Roman imperial portraiture, really fascinating once you start looking at these as political messages, which they definitely are. Just like politicians today very carefully groom their public personas and their public image to give a message that they want to communicate to potential voters. Vespasian and the other emperors, they don't really care about votes because it's not a democratic society. But they do care about keeping people satisfied, keeping them happy with the government, because the empire is expanding. Millions and millions and millions of people across a vast geographic area. Rome itself is densely populated with over 1 million people, and they understand, these emperors do, that their public image is extremely important. So Vespasian here wants to project the public image of being an emperor who cares and is considerate and who is kind and will give the gift of the Colosseum to the people, so that the people will receive him in that way and think of him in that way. The politics of the art here is really fascinating. After Vespasian, we have the Emperor Titus. And Titus is pretty well known for being an important military emperor who expanded the empire through military conquest. And what we'll see with Titus is this tendency for Roman emperors to erect very large monuments in their honor, especially after big military campaigns. And one of the most common that we'll see throughout Rome are these triumphal arches. So this is the Arch of Titus, and it's right there in the city of Rome, constructed sometime after about 81 CE. It's quite a large piece. As you can see in this photograph, we have some people standing underneath it. And what's important about these arches, they're not buildings. There's no interior structure. This is not a temple. This serves no other purpose other than to be a commemoration of a particular battle or event to honor a particular emperor. That's all they're there for. You'll see at the very top, the lintel across the top of the arch is a dedication to the emperor and his triumphs. That's why I've called it a triumphal arch. There is some decoration on the inside passageway there, so let's take a look at one of those. The Arch of Titus commemorates Titus's sack of the city of Jerusalem. So Jerusalem in that area of the world is under the dominion of the Roman Empire at this time. And we haven't had much time to talk yet about the issue of religion within the Roman Empire. The official state religion, no matter what geographic area you are in, if you are part of the Roman Empire, the official state religion is Roman paganism and the worship of the gods like Jupiter, Venus, Mars, and so on, the entire pantheon. Some religious freedom is allowed within the empire. We'll say that multiple religions are tolerated within the empire. And there's a large population of Jews that live within the empire, particularly over in the east. And of course we'll have to talk about the rise of Christianity during this time as well. Jews were pretty much tolerated in most Roman-controlled cities, but they would be segregated. They couldn't live amongst other Roman citizens, and they were often hit with higher tax rates, and they were very much discriminated against in Roman times. Titus basically decides that he doesn't want to really put up with Judaism within his empire anymore. He wants to try to eliminate and disenfranchise the Jews as much as possible. So he leads a campaign into Jerusalem to sack the major temple in Jerusalem. And that's what we're seeing in this frieze, in this image here. We're seeing a bunch of Roman soldiers after they have sacked the temple of Jerusalem. And we see what they hold on their shoulders. They're holding the spoils of war. So you can see very clearly this giant menorah this group of soldiers are carrying. And what we see them doing is carrying them out of Jerusalem in this major procession. And you can see on the right-hand side, they're going under this arch into the city of Rome. So this is their triumph. They've gone in, they've thrown out the Jews, they've sacked the temple, they've taken all of these artifacts that are so important to Judaism, and they're bringing them back to Rome as spoils of war. So this is an important event in terms of how different religions are going to be reacting with each other within the empire. At this point in the empire, with the Flavians, we'll see an increased persecution of people who worship non-Roman religion. Legally speaking, you can be of a different faith, but we're going to see less tolerance as time goes on. And a lot of this will also have to do with the Christians, Christianity is really starting to grow and develop a large base within the city of Rome and the outlying regions of the empire. And Roman imperial authority is going to begin to feel very threatened by this and will react quite violently to it, which we'll talk about a little later on. In addition to triumphal arches, we also see a few columns being put up in honor of certain emperors and their accomplishments. Most famous is probably this one, the column of Trajan, built in the Forum of Rome and was dedicated in 112 CE. It's quite a magnificent piece. It's about 150 feet high. And I'll show you a close-up of a little bit of it here, but you can still see it in this picture. There's a continuous frieze that wraps like a spiral going all the way up this column. And it's told in a continuous narrative. You could almost think of it like a continuous comic strip that tells the entire story wrapping all the way up to the top of this column. If you took that spiral and unrolled it, it would be 656 feet long. And it describes Emperor Trajan's battle against the Dacians and his eventual defeat of the Dacians. So Trajan is continuing the military conquests of Europe that are going to expand the empire. It's a really fantastic piece. A lot of skill goes into it. Originally, at the very, very top of the column, you can see the statue in the photo. Originally, that was Trajan at the top of that column. After Christianity comes into the scene and the collapse of the old Roman Empire in about 395 and the establishment of the Holy Roman Empire, the Christian Empire, the statue of Trajan will be taken down and replaced with a statue of St. Peter, who's up there right now. But originally, that was Trajan. What's really quite amazing about this column is it tells this great story of Trajan's defeat of the Dacians. But this is 150 feet tall. There's no other purpose for this. You can't really do anything with this. And because it's so tall, and in the middle of this forum, you can't really see the sculpture. You can't really see the images as they wrap up the upper part of the column. There's no way for you to stand on the ground and look up at this and be able to really tell what's going on, to be able to really read it. So in that regard, what's important about these commemorative pieces, they are entirely dedicated to the honor and glory of the emperor. They're not really meant to be functional in any way. Their only function is to glorify the emperor. So let's take a quick look at a close-up of this. So here's a scene near the bottom of that column where you can see the Romans staging for battle. This is where they're about to get on their ships and cross the Danube River. And it gives us a sense again of the expanse of the Roman Empire. We're using techniques of overlapping to create a sense of space. We have this wonderful representation of Neptune, the god of water and the sea. We have different registers as this unravels all the way up across the column. So some fantastic detail, but as I mentioned, as you go higher and higher up, no one's going to be able to see it. No one's really going to be able to read it. And again, that doesn't seem to be a concern. Trajan isn't necessarily worried that people be able to see and look at every detail of this piece. What's important to him is that it's there, that he has spent this money on it, that he has these resources. This is a way for him to show off and create this monument that you cannot ignore because it's 150 feet tall, to his greatness and to his power as emperor. Again, just a part of the politics of Roman representation. So Trajan is involved in some other building projects, not just his column. He's also quite famous for building the markets of Rome. And so here we see an aerial view of the markets of Trajan. This is very much what it sounds like. It's a marketplace, very, very similar actually to a modern-day shopping mall. So it was one central location, inside of which you had storefronts. Then you had access and storage areas. And if you lived in the city of Rome, again, this very densely populated city, whatever you happen to need in terms of home items, food, textiles, just any of the basic items that you need for day-to-day life, you had one central marketplace that was an enclosed marketplace that you could go to. So let's take a look at the inside of this. Here we are up on the second floor of the Trajan markets, looking down into the lower level. And I think here you can get a great sense of how much like a shopping mall this is. You have sort of the central concourse, you have upper and lower levels, and you can see the individual storefronts there where you could go in and buy your goods. Very much like a regular shopping mall today. Nice big barrel vaulted ceiling. We're seeing a great deal of brickwork and some nice masonry here. We do have some pretty advanced architectural systems here to try to create a very stable and sturdy place that can be used for many generations. What we're noticing with Rome, because it is so densely populated, they have all of the problems of dense urban living that we today have. How do we get fresh water in and out of the city? How did we distribute goods? And so we'll see this reliance on these large central areas, congregation points. We already have the Colosseum, of course, which is our main entertainment complex for the city. Then we'll have this huge marketplace, which allows commerce to be concentrated in one major part of the city. And then we'll have the Forum, which is where government business and official business gets disseminated throughout the city. So obviously in a time when we don't have electronic or immediate forms of communication, these centralized locations are how the citizenry of Rome are really going to get their information, get their goods, exchange money, and the business of running a city is really done in these sorts of venues. I have one more shot of the market here to show you. So here's another view of the market, and you can see we had interior and exterior shops and storefronts, probably again looking very similar to how a shopping mall looks today. So this is going to conclude part one of this this lecture. There will be a part two, of course. So look for the YouTube link on the next slide, and we'll continue talking about Imperial Rome and the eventual decline of Rome.